Bostil went toward the house with his daughter, turning at the door to call a last word to his riders about the care of his horses. The house was a low, flat, wide structure, with a corridor running through the middle, from which doors led into adobe-walled rooms. The windows were small openings high up, evidently intended for defense as well as light, and they had rude wooden shutters. The floor was clay, covered everywhere by Indian blankets. A pioneer's home it was, simple and crude yet comfortable, and having the rare quality peculiar to desert homes, it was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. As Bostil entered with his arm round Lucy, a big hound rose from the hearth. This room was immense, running the length of the house, and it contained a huge stone fireplace where a kettle smoked fragrantly, and rude home-made chairs with blanket coverings and tables to match, and walls covered with bridles, guns, pistols, Indian weapons and ornaments, and trophies of the chase. In a far corner stood a workbench, with tools upon it and horse trappings under it. In the opposite corner a door led into the kitchen. This room was Bostil's famous living room, in which many things had happened, some of which had helped make desert history and were never mentioned by Bostil. Bostil's sister came in from the kitchen. She was a huge person with a severe yet motherly face. She had her hands on her hips, and she cast a rather disapproving glance at father and daughter. "So you're back again?" she queried severely. "Sure, Auntie," replied the girl complacently. "You ran off to get out of seeing Weatherby, didn't you?" Lucy stared sweetly at her aunt. "He was waiting for hours," went on the worthy woman. "I never saw a man in such a stew. No wonder, playing fast and loose with him the way you do." "I told him no," flashed Lucy. "But Weatherby's not the kind to take no, and I'm not satisfied to let you mean it. Lucy Bostil, you don't know your mind an hour straight running. You fooled enough with these riders of your dad's. If you're not careful, you'll marry one of them. One of these wild riders, as bad as a Ute Indian. Weatherby is young, and he idolizes you. In all common sense, why don't you take him?" "I don't care for him," replied Lucy. "You like him as well as anybody. John Bostil, what do you say? You approved of Weatherby. I heard you tell him Lucy was like an unbroken colt, and that you'd—" "Sure I like Jim," interrupted Bostil, and he avoided Lucy's swift look. "Well?" demanded his sister. Evidently Bostil found himself in a corner between two fires. He looked sheepish, then disgusted. "Dad!" exclaimed Lucy reproachfully. "See here, Jane," said Bostil with an air of finality. "The girl is of age today, and she can do what she damn pleases." "That's a fine thing for you to say," retorted Aunt Jane. "Like as not she'll be fetching that hangdog Joel Creech up here for you to support." "Auntie!" cried Lucy, her eyes blazing. "Oh, child, you torment me, worry me so," said the disappointed woman. "It's all for your sake. Look at you, Lucy Bostil, girl of 18 who comes of a family, and you riding around and going around as you are now, in a man's clothes." "But you dear old goose, I can't ride in a woman's skirt," expostulated Lucy. "Mind you, Auntie, I can ride." "Lucy, if I live here forever, I'd never get reconciled to a Bostil woman in leather pants. We Bostils were somebody once, back in Missouri." Bostil laughed. "Yes, and if I hadn't hit the trail west, we'd be starving yet. Jane, you're a sentimental old fool. Let the girl alone and reconcile yourself to the wilderness." Aunt Jane's eyes were wet with tears. Lucy, seeing them, ran to her and hugged and kissed her. "Auntie, I promise, from today, to have some dignity. I've been free as a boy in these rider's clothes. As I am now, the men never seem to regard me as a girl. Somehow that's better. I can't explain, but I like it. My dresses are what have caused all the trouble, I know that. But if I'm grown up, if it's so tremendous, then I'll wear a dress all the time except just when I ride. Will that do, Auntie?" "Maybe you will grow up after all," replied Aunt Jane, evidently surprised and pleased. Then Lucy, with clinking spurs, ran away to her room. "Jane, what's this nonsense about young Joel Creech?" asked Bostil gruffly. I don't know any more than is gossiped. That I told you. Have you asked Lucy about him?" "I sure haven't," said Bostil bluntly. "Well, ask her. If she tells you at all, she'll tell the truth. Lucy'd never sleep at night if she lied." Aunt Jane returned to her housewifely tasks, leaving Bostil thoughtfully stroking the hound and watching the fire. Presently Lucy returned, a different Lucy, one that did not rouse his rider's pride but thrilled his father's heart. She had been a slim, lithe, supple, dishevelled boy, breathing the wild spirit of the open in the horse she rode. She was now a girl in the graceful roundness of her slender form, with hair the gold of the sage at sunset, and eyes the blue of the deep haze of distance, and lips the sweet red of the upland rose, and all about her seemed different. "Lucy, you look like she used to be," said Bostil unsteadily. "My mother," murmured Lucy. But these two, so keen, so strong, so alive, did not abide long with sad memories. "Lucy, I wanted to ask you something," said Bostil presently. "What about this young Joel Creech?" Lucy started as if suddenly recalled. Then she laughed merrily. "Dad, you old fox, did you see him ride out after me?" "No, I was just asking on general principles." "What do you mean?" "Lucy, is there anything between you and Joel?" he asked gravely. "No," she replied, with her clear eyes up to his. Bostil thought of a bluebell. "I'm begging your pardon," he said hastily. "Dad, you know how Joel runs after me. I've told you. I let him till lately. I liked him, but that wasn't why. I felt sorry for him. Pitied him." "You did? Well, seems an awful waste," replied Bostil. "Dad, I don't believe Joel is perfectly right in his mind," Lucy said solemnly. "Ah, fine compliments you're paying yourself." "Listen, I'm serious. I mean, I've grown to see, looking back, that a slow, gradual change has come over Joel since he was kicked in the head by a mustang. I'm sure no one else has noticed it." "Going batty over you. That's no unusual sign round this here camp. Look at—" "We're talking about Joel Creech. Lately he has done some queer things. Today, for instance, I thought I gave him the slip, but he must have been watching. Anyway, to my surprise, he showed up on Peg. He doesn't often get Peg across the river. He said the feed was getting scarce over there. I was dying to race Buckles against Peg, but I remembered you wouldn't like that." "I should say not," said Bostil darkly. "Well, Joel caught up to me, and he wasn't nice at all. He was worse today. We quarreled. I said I'd bet he'd never follow me again, and he said he'd bet he would. Then he got sulky and hung back. I rode away, glad to be rid of him, and I climbed to a favorite place of mine. On my way home I saw Peg grazing on the rim of the creek, near that big spring hole where the water's so deep and clear. And what do you think? There was Joel's head above the water. I remembered in our quarrel I had told him to go wash his dirty face. He was doing it. I had to laugh. When he saw me, Then he, Lucy faltered, blushing with anger and shame. "Well, what then?" demanded Bostil quietly. "He called, 'Hey, Luce, take off your clothes and come in for a swim.'" Bostil swore. "I tell you I was mad," continued Lucy, "and just as surprised. That was one of the queer things, but never before had he dared to— "Insult you." "Then what'd you do?" interrupted Bostil curiously. "I yelled, 'I'll fix you, Joel Creech!' His clothes were in a pile on the bank. At first I thought I'd throw them in the water, but when I got to them I thought of something better. I took up all but his shoes, for I remembered the 10 miles of rock and cactus between him and home, and I climbed up on Buckles. Joel screamed and swore something fearful, but I didn't look back. And Peg you know, or maybe you don't know, but Peg is fond of me, and he followed me, straddling his bridle all the way in. I dropped Joel's clothes down the ridge-a-ways, right on the trail, so he can't miss them, and that's all." "Dad, was it Was it very bad?
Bad? Why, you ought to have thrown your gun on him. At least bounced a rock off his head. But say, Lucy, after all, maybe you've done enough. I guess you never thought of it.
What?
The sun is hot today. Hot. And if Joel's as crazy and mad as you say, he'll not have sense enough to stay in the water or shade till the sun's gone down. And if he tackles that 10 miles before, he'll sunburn himself within an inch of his life.
Sunburn? Oh, Dad, I'm sorry, burst out Lucy contritely. I never thought of that. I'll ride back with his clothes.
You will not, said Bostil.
Well, let me send someone then, she entreated.
Girl, haven't you the nerve to play your own game? Let Creech get his lesson. He deserves it. And now, Lucy, I've got 2 more questions to ask.
Only 2? She queried archly. Dad, don't scold me with questions.
What shall I say to Weatherby for good and all?
Lucy's eyes shaded dreamily, and she seemed to look beyond the room out over the ranges. Tell him to go back to Durango, and forget the foolish girl who can care only for the desert and a horse.
All right, that's straight talk, like an Indian's. And now the last question. What do you want for a birthday present?
Oh, of course, she cried, gleefully clapping her hands. I'd forgotten that. I'm 18.
You get that old chest to your mother's, but what from me?
Dad, will you give me anything I ask for?
Yes, my girl.
Anything? Any horse?
Lucy knew his weakness, for she had inherited it. Sure. Any horse but the king.
How about Sarchedon?
Why, Lucy, what'd you want with that big black devil? He's too high. 17 hands high. You couldn't mount him.
Pooh, Sarch kneels for me.
Child, listen to reason. Sarch would pull your arms out of their sockets.
He does have an iron jaw, agreed Lucy. Well then, how about Dusty Ben? She was tormenting her father, and she did it with glee.
No, not Ben. He's the faithfulest hoss I ever owned. Wouldn't be fair to part with him, even to you. Old associations, a rider's loyalty. Now, Lucy, you know...
Dad, you're afraid I'd train and love Ben into beating the king. Some day I'll ride a horse out in front of the Grey. Remember, Dad. Well, then give me Two-Face.
Sure not her, Lucy. That mare can't be trusted. Look why we named her Two-Face.
Buckles, then, dear, generous daddy who longs to give his grown-up girl anything.
Lucy, can't you be satisfied and happy with your mustangs? You've got a dozen. You can have any others on the range. Buckles ain't safe for you to ride.
Bostil was notably the most generous of men, the kindest of fathers. It was an indication of his strange obsession in regard to horses that he never would see that Lucy was teasing him. As far as horses were concerned, he lacked a sense of humor. Anything connected with his horses was of intense interest. "I'd dearly love to own Plume," said Lucy demurely. Bostil had grown red in the face, and now he was on the rack. The monstrous selfishness of a rider who had been supreme in his day could not be changed.
"Girl, I thought you'd have no use for Plume," he stammered.
"I haven't, the jade. She threw me once. I've never forgiven her." "Oh, Dad, I'm only teasing you. Don't I know you couldn't give any one of those racers away? You couldn't."
"Oh, Lucy, I reckon you're right," Bostil burst out in immense relief.
"Dad, I'll bet if Quartz gets me and holds me as ransom for the king, as he's threatened, you'll let him have me."
"Lucy, now that ain't funny," complained the father.
"Dear Dad, keep your old racers. But remember, I am my father's daughter. I can love a horse, too. Oh, if I ever get the one I want to love. A wild horse, a desert stallion, pure Arabian, broken right by an Indian. If I ever get him, Dad, you look out, for I'll run away from Sarch and Ben, and I'll beat the king." The hamlet of Bostil's Ford had a singular situation, though, considering the wonderful nature of that desert country, it was not exceptional. It lay under the protecting red bluff that only Lucy Bostil cared to climb. A hard-trodden road wound down through rough breaks in the canyon wall to the river. Bostil's house, at the head of the village, looked in the opposite direction, down the sage slope that widened like a colossal fan. There was one wide street bordered by cottonwoods and cabins, and a number of gardens and orchards, beginning to burst into green and pink and white. A brook ran out of a ravine in the huge bluff, and from this led irrigation ditches. The red earth seemed to blossom at the touch of water. The place resembled an Indian encampment, quiet, sleepy, colorful, with the tiny streams of water running everywhere, and lazy columns of blue wood smoke rising. Bostil's Ford was the opposite of a busy village, yet its few inhabitants, as a whole, were prosperous. The wants of pioneers were few. Perhaps once a month a big, clumsy flatboat was rowed across the river with horses or cattle or sheep, and the season was now close at hand when weeks, sometimes months, the river was unfordable. There were a score of permanent families, a host of merry, sturdy children, a number of idle young men, and only one girl, Lucy Bostil. But the village always had transient inhabitants, friendly Utes and Navajos into trade, and sheep-herders with a scraggly, woolly flock, and travelers of the strange religious sect identified with Utah going on into the wilderness. Then there were always riders passing to and fro, and sometimes unknown ones regarded with caution. Horse thieves sometimes boldly rode in, and sometimes were able to sell or trade. In the matter of horse stealing, Bostil's Ford was as bold as the thieves. Old Bracton, a man of varied Western experience, kept the one store, which was tavern, trading post, freighter's headquarters, blacksmith shop, and anything else needful. Bracton employed riders, teamsters, sometimes Indians, to freight supplies in once a month from Durango, and that was over 200 miles away. Sometimes the supplies did not arrive on time, occasionally not at all. News from the outside world, except what elicited from taciturn drivers marching into Utah, drifted in at intervals, but it was not missed. These wilderness spirits were the forerunners of a great movement, and as such were big, strong, stern, sufficient unto themselves. Life there was made possible by horses. The distant future that looked bright to far-seeing men must be and could only be fulfilled through the endurance and faithfulness of horses, and then from these men horses received the meed due them, and the love they were truly worth. The Navajo was a nomad horseman, an Arab of the painted desert, and the Ute Indian was close to him. It was they who developed the white riders of the uplands, as well as the wild horse wrangler or hunter. Bracton's ramshackle establishment stood on the end of the village street. There was not a sawed board in all that structure, and some of the pine logs showed how they had been dropped from the bluff. Bracton, a little old grey man with a scant beard and eyes like those of a bird, came briskly out to meet an incoming freighter. The wagon was minus a hind wheel, but the teamster had come in on 3 wheels and a pole. The sweaty, dust-caked, weary, thin-ribbed mustangs, and the grey and red-stained wagon, and the huge jumble of dusty packs showed something of what the journey had been.
"Hi thar, Red Wilson. You are some late getting in," greeted old Bracton.
Red Wilson had red eyes from fighting the flying sand, and red dust pasted in his scraggly beard, and as he gave his belt an upward hitch little red clouds flew from his gun-sheath.
"Yep, and I left a wheel and part of the load on the trail," he said.
With him were Indians who began to unhitch the teams. Riders lounging in the shade greeted Wilson and inquired for news. The teamster replied that travel was dry, the water-holes were dry, and he was dry, and his reply gave both concern and amusement.
"One more trip out and back. That's all till it rains," concluded Wilson.
Bracton led him inside, evidently to alleviate part of that dryness. Water and grass next to horses were the stock subject of all riders.
"It's gotten common hot early," said one. "Yes, and them northeast winds hard this spring," said another. "No snow on the uplands. Holly's seen a dry spell coming. Wall, we can drift along without freighters. There's grass and water even here, even if it don't rain. Sure, but there's none across the river. Never was an early season, and if there was, it'd be sheeped off. Creech'll be fetching his hosses across soon, I reckon. You bet he will. He's training for the races next month. When are they coming off? Now you got me. Maybe Van knows.
Someone prodded a sleepy rider who lay all his splendid lithe length hat over his eyes. Then he sat up and blinked, a lean-faced, grey-eyed fellow, half good-natured and half resentful.
Did somebody punch me? Nah, you got a nightmare. Say, Van, when will the races come off? Huh? And you woke me for that? Well, Bostil says in a few weeks, soon as he hears from the Indians. Plans to have 800 Indians here, and the biggest purses and best races ever had at the ford. You'll ride the king again? I reckon so. The Bostil is kicking because I'm heavier than I was, replied the rider. You're skin and bones at that. Well, maybe you need to work a little off, Van. Someone said Creech's Blue Roan was coming fast this year. Bill, your mind ain't operating, replied Van scornfully. Didn't I beat Creech's hosses last year without the king turning a hair? Not if I recollect you didn't. Blue Roan wasn't running.
Then they argued after the manner of friendly riders, but all earnest and eloquent in their convictions. The prevailing opinion was that Creech's horse had a chance, depending upon condition and luck. The argument shifted upon the arrival of two newcomers, leading mustangs and apparently talking trade. It was manifest that these arrivals were not loath to get the opinions of others.
Van, there's a hoss, exclaimed one.
No, he ain't, replied Van. And that diverse judgment appeared to be characteristic throughout. The strange thing was that Macomber, the rancher, had already traded his mustang and money to boot for the sorrel. The deal, whether wise or not, had been consummated. Bracton came out with Red Wilson, and they had to have their say.
Wall darned if some of you fellers ain't kind of complimentary, remarked Macomber, scratching his head. But then every feller can't have hoss sense.
Then, looking up to see Lucy Bostil coming up along the road, he brightened as if with inspiration. Lucy was at home among them, and the shy eyes of the younger riders, especially Van, were nothing if not revealing. She greeted them with a bright smile, and when she saw Bracton she burst out, "Oh, Mr. Bracton, the wagon's in, and did my box come? Today's my birthday."
"'Deed it did, Lucy, and many more happy ones to you," he replied, delighted in her delight. "But it's too heavy for you. I'll send it up, or maybe one of the boys."
5 riders in unison eagerly offered their services, and looked as if each had spoken first. Then Macomber addressed her.
"Miss Lucy, you see this here sorrel?"
"Ha! The same lazy crowd and the same old story. A horse trade," laughed Lucy.
"There's a little difference of opinion," Macomber politely indicating the riders. "Now, Miss Lucy, we all know you're a judge of a hoss, and as good as that you tell the truth. That ain't in some hoss traders I know. What do you think of this mustang?"
Macomber had eyes of enthusiasm for his latest acquisition, but some of the cocksureness had been knocked out of him by the blunt riders. "Macomber, aren't you a great one to talk?" queried Lucy severely. "Didn't you get around Dad and trade him an old, blind, knock-kneed bag of bones for a perfectly good pony, one I like to ride?" The riders shouted with laughter while the rancher struggled with confusion.
"'Pon my word, Miss Lucy, I'm surprised you could think that of such an old friend of yours, and your dad's, too. I'm hoping he doesn't side altogether with you."
"Dad and I never agree about a horse. He thinks he's got the best of you. But you know, Macomber, what a horse thief you are. Worse than Courts."
"Well, if I got the best of Bostil, I'm willing to be thought bad. I'm the first feller to take him in. And now, Miss Lucy, look over my sorrel."
Lucy Bostil did indeed have an eye for a horse. She walked straight up to the wild, shaggy mustang with a confidence born of intuition and experience, and reached a hand for his head, not slowly, yet not swiftly. The mustang looked as if he was about to jump, but he did not. His eyes showed that he was not used to women. "He's not well broken," said Lucy. "Some Navajo has beaten his head in breaking him." Then she carefully studied the mustang point by point. "He's deceiving at first because he's good to look at," said Lucy. "But I wouldn't own him. The saddle will turn on him. He's not vicious, but he'll never get over his scare. He's narrow between the eyes, a bad sign. His ears are stiff and too close. Other than that, I don't see anything more wrong with him."
"You've seen enough," declared Macomber. "And so you wouldn't own him?"
"You couldn't make me a present of him, even on my birthday."
"Well, now I'm sorry, for I was thinking of that," replied Macomber ruefully.
It was plain that the sorrel had fallen irretrievably in his estimation. "Macomber, I often tell Dad all you horse traders get your deserts now and then. It's vanity and desire to beat the other man that's your downfall." Lucy went away with Van shouldering her box, leaving Macomber trying to return the banter of the riders. The good-natured raillery was interrupted by a sharp word from one of them.
"Look! Darn me if that ain't a naked Indian coming!"
The riders whirled to see an apparently nude savage approaching, almost on a run.
"Take a shot at that, Bill," said another rider. "Miss Lucy might see. No, she's out of sight, but maybe some other woman is around." "Hold on, Bill," called Macomber. "You never saw an Indian run like that."
Some of the riders swore, others laughed, and all suddenly became keen with interest.
"Sure his face is white, but his body's red."
The strange figure neared them. It was indeed red up to the face, which seemed white in contrast, yet only in general shape and action did it resemble a man.
"Well, damned if it ain't Joel Creech!"
sang out Bill Stark. The other riders accorded their wondering assent.
"Oh, he's gone crazy, sure. Always seen it coming. Say, but ain't he wild? Foaming at the mouth like a winded hoss."
Young Creech was headed down the road toward the ford across which he had to go to reach home. He saw the curious group, slowed his pace, and halted. His face seemed convulsed with rage and pain and fatigue. His body, even to his hands, was encased in a thick, heavy coating of red adobe that had caked hard.
God's sakes, fellers," he panted, with eyes rolling. "Take this adobe mud off me. I'm dying."
Then he staggered into Bracton's place. A howl went up from the riders, and they surged after him. That evening after supper, Bostil stamped into the big room, roaring with laughter, red in the face, and he astonished Lucy and her aunt to the point of consternation.
"Ho, ho! Now you've done it, Lucy Bostil," he roared.
Oh dear!" exclaimed Aunt Jane. "Done what?" asked Lucy blankly. Bostil conquered his paroxysm, and, wiping his moist red face, he eyed Lucy in mock solemnity. "Joel," whispered Lucy, who had a guilty conscience.
"Lucy, I never heard the beat of it. Joel's smarter in some ways than we thought, and crazier in others. He had the son figured, but what he'd want to run through town for. Why, never in my life have I seen such tickled riders."
"Dad!" almost screamed Lucy. "What did Joel do?"
"Well, I see it this way. He couldn't or wouldn't wait for sundown, and he wasn't hankering to be burned. So he wallows in a 'dobe mud hole and covers himself thick with mud. You know that 'dobe mud. Then he starts home. But he hadn't figured on the 'dobe getting hard, which it did, harden a rock, and that must have hurt more than a sunburn. Late this afternoon he came running down the road yelling that he was dying. The boys had knipped in fits. Joel ain't overliked, you know, and here they had one on him. Maybe they didn't try hard to clean him off. But the fact is, not for hours did they get that 'dobe off him. They washed and scrubbed and curried him while he yelled and cussed. Finally they peeled it off with his skin, I guess. He was raw, and they say the maddest feller ever seen in Bostil's Ford."
Lucy was struggling between fear and mirth. She did not look sorry. Oh, Dad!"
Wasn't it great, Lucy?"
But what will he do?" choked Lucy.
"Lord only knows. That worries me some. Because he never said a word about how he came to lose his clothes or why he had the dobie on him. And sure I never told. Nobody knows but us."
"Dad, he'll do something terrible to me," cried Lucy, aghast at her premonition.